A warm evening covered the streets of a small town in the southern United States. The lamps of the old street lights burned dimly, casting long shadows on the cracked asphalt. The air smelled of hot concrete, humidity, and something else. Elusive but eerie. An atmosphere of fear, invisibly present in every nook and cranny. There was an unspoken rule on these streets. If you were the wrong color, walk fast, don't make eye contact, don't linger, especially if Mike Douglas was on patrol. Mike sat in his police car, drumming his fingers lazily on the steering wheel. He was bored. It was one of those nights when he wanted to take out his anger on someone he considered beneath him. And then he saw her. The dark-skinned girl walked along the street, holding her backpack with one hand. Slender, her head held high, she walked with a confident stride, but in this city, even confidence could be a mistake. Her name was Eliza Johnson, the daughter of a respectable man, but now, on this street, she was nothing but easy prey. Douglas's eyes narrowed. "Here's a client for the night," he muttered with a smirk, turning on his blinkers. Red and blue flashes cut through the darkness, flooding the street with cold light. The car sped away, approaching the girl, and stopped a few meters in front of her with a screech of tires. Eliza shuddered. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she didn't have to do anything. The police door slammed, and Mike Douglas stepped outside. Tall, massive, with a cocky look, he stared at her like a predator at prey. "Hey, stay where you are." His voice cut through the air like a knife. Eliza tensed, but didn't move. "Is something wrong, officer?" She tried to speak calmly, but panicked fear was already starting to beat in her chest. Douglas slowly stepped closer, looking down at her with a lazy grin. "I said documents." Now Eliza frowned. "But why? I'm just going home." "You look suspicious." She clenched her teeth. Suspicious? What did that mean? A dark-skinned student in her own town? She'd heard stories like that. Girls who'd been stopped, humiliated, and then released if they were lucky. "Please, officer, I didn't do anything. I don't get to decide what you've done." He stepped closer, and in that moment, Eliza realized that he had already decided how this was going to end. A moment, and her arm was pawed behind her back. She cried out, "Hey, watch out!" But her voice is drowned in the night. No one intervenes. The people standing nearby only turn away. The handcuffs snapped on with a metallic click. She was no longer the student, the smart girl, the daughter of a strong man. In his eyes, she was just another black woman who needed to be shown her place. But he didn't even realize he'd picked the wrong victim, because in 3 minutes his life would be broken. The handcuffs closed around Eliza's wrists with a rough metallic click. "Okay, baby, you're mine now." Mike Douglas's voice was imbued with a nasty, smug confidence, as if he'd just caught a dangerous criminal. In fact, he had caught the daughter of an FBI agent, but he didn't know it yet. Elise cried out as he twisted her arms, forcing her to bend over the hood of the police car. The cold metal of the car pressed against her face, and she smelled oil and dust. "What are you doing?" She tried to turn her head, but Douglas pushed harder. "You insolent bitch. Don't ask questions unless you want me to find something forbidden on you." Eliza clenched her teeth. She knew the trick. He could plant anything, drugs, weapons, even fake IDs, and then her future would go to hell. "I didn't do anything," she hissed. "Really?" He smirked, turning to his partners standing nearby. "Look at her, the daughter of a wealthy family, and she acts like a street animal." The other two officers stood a little apart, watching. They glanced over, but did not interfere. The laws worked differently in this town. If you're white, you're the boss. If you're black, you obey. A crowd was beginning to gather. A few passers-by stopped, but no one dared to say a word. Someone pulled out a cell phone, but Douglas glanced in his direction and the man immediately put it back away. "You're coming with me, you filthy bitch." He grabbed Eliza by the hair and yanked her head back, forcing her to face him. "I hope you like nights in a cell with other scum like you. They'll put you in your place in no time." Her heart was beating in a frantic rhythm. She knew she shouldn't show fear, but she was shaking. "Officer, please don't. I just want to go home." "What are you, a smart ass?" He grinned, snapping the handcuffs angrily in front of her face. "You think you belong at home?" "Oh, no, 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 no. People like you belong in a cage." Eliza squirmed. "Now you know how to walk the streets like it's your town, nigger." The crowd around them whispered, but everyone was silent. Her fingers clenched into fists. But in 3 minutes, that's going to change. In 3 minutes, he'll know exactly who he's arrested. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments what city you are from, and whether this is the first time you're listening to our stories. Maybe something similar happened to you or someone you know. Share your opinion. It's very important. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. Back up at 5th and Broadway. Suspected resisting arrest. Now, Mike Douglas pressed a button on his radio and grinned at Eliza, who was still lying on the hood of his car. He deliberately pressed his elbow harder on her back, making her moan in pain. "That's it, bitch. Let's get used to the right position. You like to stand proud, don't you? Bend over a little lower." She clenched her teeth, not giving him the pleasure of hearing her fear. But inside, everything trembled with hatred and helplessness. Meanwhile, the police radio wave blasted the message across the city, passing through the noise of the streets, crossing other frequencies, filling the airwaves with indifference. But this time, she was heard by someone who shouldn't have heard her. Across town, in a dark office lit by the bluish light of monitors, a man sat at his desk. Tall, sturdy, with eyes accustomed to danger. Cold, steely determination flowed through his veins. Marcus Johnson, FBI agent, father. All day long he had a strange feeling, like something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what it was. His intuition, in his years of working with the most dangerous criminals, was rarely wrong. And then this message came through. Suspect, female, resisting arrest. Somewhere inside, a toggle switch clicked. His heart clenched. He couldn't hear the name, but he knew it was his daughter. Marcus froze. His hand froze over the table. Then, after a moment, his body moved faster than lightning splits the sky. The chair flew back with a clatter. He grabbed his keys and ran out of the office, his thoughts already turning into a clear plan of destruction. 3 seconds later, he was in the parking lot. 10 seconds later, his black-armored SUV, powered by a specially modified engine, roared like a released beast. 15 seconds later, he was already out on the highway picking up speed. After 20 seconds, there was nothing left in his eyes but rage. The steering wheel clenched until his fingers ached, his heart pounded in his chest, but his thoughts were as cold as ice. Unlike a normal father, he knew what to do. "You just try it, asshole. Just try it." His gaze darted between the road and the second hand of the clock. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. He ran the first traffic light on red. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Went through the stream of cars, causing drivers to fly apart. 2 minutes and 15 seconds. His hand reached for the glove compartment where his badge and something far more dangerous lay. 2 minutes. He was already 2 blocks away. The police car was still parked there. The cop had her daughter in handcuffs. One look, one quick glance at the way the bastard was humiliating Eliza, pressing the back of her head, saying something through a smirk. And something inside Marcus snapped. A minute and a half, hitting the gas, 1 second. The SUV flew into the intersection and hell came to this town. Mike Douglas stood in front of his police car holding Elise by the handcuffs, savoring the moment. Confidence was already burning in his eyes. He could see her being dragged into the station, how she would stand there, humiliated, confused, how her life would begin to crumble under his imperious gaze. She was already a nobody, and now her place was in a cage among other black problems. He turned to his colleagues with a smug grin. "Come on, guys, let's not waste any time. Let's get her info, and then we'll take a break. It's times like this that I like to feel like I own the street." His hand gripped the cuffs on Elise's wrists even tighter, causing her to let out a painful sigh. She was silent, but her eyes, full of anger, couldn't hide how badly she'd been humiliated. But at that moment, when he was completely absorbed in his triumph, there was another sound in the air, the deafening roar of an engine. It was powerful, low, like an approaching storm, and it caused everyone present to stand still for a moment. Mike didn't even have time to turn his head before a huge black SUV with shiny armored doors slammed into a car stopped at the sidewalk, causing a massive impact that shook the entire area. The engine was still roaring as the SUV braked sharply and came to a stop right in front of him. The window opened and a man stepped out of the car. He was tall, in an austere suit, with an expression on his face that would have been murderous if it hadn't been for the calmness with which he moved. His gaze was fierce, but there was a deadly restraint about him, as if he were simply deciding how to end someone's life. The man walked slowly and steadily toward the police officers, his steps so sure that they seemed a threat even to the air itself. Eliza lifted her head slightly, and despite all the pain she felt, she noticed him. His face, his eyes. Those eyes weren't just filled with anger, but something deeper. They were full of confidence, almost calm, and, at the same time, a fierce desire to punish. Mike froze in place as the man stopped just a few feet away from him. "Check this suspect's ID. But be careful not to break her arms. She'll come in handy." His voice was dark, deep, and utterly unemotional, as if he were speaking to someone who had been in his power for a long time. He was in no hurry to show emotion or overt threat, but something about his presence made the air around him fill with tension. It was like an electric shock. Mike felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to turn around to continue the conversation, but something in the man's eyes stopped him. It was like death. Mike realized he had made a mistake from which there would be no easy way out. Bitterness clenched in his chest. He didn't know who this man was, but he could see by his certainty that he was on the verge of destroying his life. And no matter how hard he tried to brush that feeling away, it wouldn't go away. The man stepped forward. The fingers on his right hand tensed slightly, as if he were ready to draw his weapon at any moment. But there was no need for a weapon. All he needed was one look. "Do you really think you could do that to my daughter?" His voice was icy, but it cut through everything like an axe through ice. Mike said nothing. Like a scolded child, he couldn't get a word out. He didn't even realize why his knees were buckling. It wasn't fear. It was a sense of the fate that was about to overtake him, and the man was standing beside him, his gaze staring straight into Douglas's eyes, and the whole atmosphere seemed to be filled with a deadly silence. It was as if the stars in the night sky were already consumed by that gaze. 3 minutes, and his life, as he knew it, would be over. Everything that was happening at that moment didn't seem real. Elise, who was lying on the hood of the police car, shifted her gaze to the man in the strict suit. Her heart was beating faster than ever. She didn't know who this man was, but she could see his presence consuming everything around her. Mike Douglas felt his skin grow cold. Everything he knew, the whole world he ruled and controlled, all of it suddenly began to blur. The man in front of him didn't look like the people he encountered every day. This was not someone who could be intimidated. This was a man whose gaze could tear a man to shreds. Marcus Johnson took his time. He slowly removed his ID card from his pocket, but he was in no hurry to show it. His fingers clutched the plastic, and his face expressed nothing but detached confidence. When he opened the ID card, everyone seemed to freeze. It was as open as a sentence, and Marcus's gaze was directed straight at Douglas. "FBI, sir." His voice was so calm that it gave the impression of a dangerous silence that could explode at any moment. Mike looked at his colleagues uncertainly, but their eyes said it all. They realized that they hadn't just witnessed a showdown with a dark-skinned criminal. They had witnessed fate. That policeman had just ruined his life. Marcus's words penetrated straight into the soul of everyone present, like a knife point that you can't see but feel on your skin. Mike felt his heart clench in his chest. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to justify himself. Every word he tried to squeeze out came back to him like an echo and turned into nothing. Marcus didn't let go of his gaze as if it were connected to his own soul. He stepped forward, slowly but steadily approaching, and the whole world seemed to revolve around that single moment. He said, "Did you really think I wouldn't find out what you did to my daughter? Did you think you could do that to her because she's black?" Douglas tried to open his mouth, but no words came out. He realized that he couldn't change anything. A few seconds ago, he had been a confident policeman, ready to humiliate, intimidate, and put down anyone he deemed suspicious. Now he felt his own life slipping away from him. "You thought you owned the streets. You thought you could bully people because your white co-workers wouldn't stop you." Marcus continued, not slowing down. His voice was so calm that it seemed to penetrate right into the heart of every cop, making them feel guilty for remaining silent. "You made a mistake. You made a deadly mistake." Douglas's colleagues stood motionless. Each of them realized that they had witnessed something more than just the proceedings with the offender. They had witnessed the end of their friend's career, and perhaps his life. They witnessed the consequences of their silent participation in racism. They were standing next to a man who was not just ready to tear Mike apart, but to completely destroy his world. Mike felt his lips dry and his knees start to buckle. He looked at his colleagues, but they didn't move. They didn't dare interfere, knowing it was none of their business. This world is set up so that you don't need to be right to punish people like you. You just need to know who's standing in your way. And as an FBI agent, I'm telling you, your life is over. Mike, trying to maintain some form, took a step back. But every step he took, every attempt to retreat, only increased the sense of defeat. His face was tempestuous, his eyes empty. All he wanted was for everything to disappear, to regain at least some of the control he had once felt. But that was the moment he realized he had lost everything. Marcus stood in front of the policeman like a rock. His eyes were cold, merciless, and his voice, when he spoke, seemed to echo from hell itself. Every word came out of his mouth with such determination that even the most resilient man, like Mike Douglas, couldn't help but feel his world crumbling. "Uncuff her." Now, his order sounded as if it were not a suggestion, but a law. Marcus's lips had spoken a decision from which there was no turning back. Policeman Mike, who had just felt great, now stood before that gaze like a boy who had been caught by the hand. His hand nervously reached for the handcuffs, but every step it took was a break, every glance at him a challenge. He couldn't realize that in that moment he had lost everything. His trembling fingers struggled with the lock, but he still uncuffed Eliza. As soon as the handcuffs hit the ground, Eliza instantly straightened up as best she could. She didn't say a word. She just stood up, but her eyes never took her eyes off the man who had just freed her, who had spared her humiliation. She felt her chest fill with a sense of liberation, but for a second, looking at her father, she realized that this moment was both a victory and a sacrifice for her. She realized that her father was willing to do anything to protect her, and there was no room for doubt in his eyes. It was a moment when fates were intertwined. Mike stepped back, but his legs wouldn't hold him up. At that moment, his shoulders began to slump, as if the world around him had shrunk to a single point. He wanted to say something, but his voice trailed off. It was a moment when all his certainties, all his racism, all his power crumbled. He was nothing. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a man with the right to dominate. He was just a guilty man. Then Marcus moved forward. His step was unhurried, but so sure that the air beneath his feet seemed to try to recede. He came in close, and before Mike realized what had happened, his fist had already slammed into his stomach. It wasn't just a blow, it was a blow of fate. Mike settled to his knees as if someone had knocked the strength out of him. His stomach clenched and he grabbed at it, but there was no air. He couldn't breathe, his body wouldn't respond to the command. All he could do was watch as the man he once thought was nothing looked at him like dust. There was fear in Douglas's eyes, but it wasn't the kind of fear that could be hidden behind a smile or rudeness. It was the fear of losing everything that filled him from head to toe. It wasn't just physically that he was struck. It was a blow that took away not only his air, but his dignity. The policemen standing nearby looked at each other, but no one dared to intervene. In their eyes was the fear that had just been released at that moment. They realized that in that instant they were witnessing not just a fight, but a sunset. They were witnessing their coworker, their friend, ruining their lives. But despite this, they could do nothing. They dared not even move. The power in front of them was so great that it seemed like all the strength in their body had evaporated. Marcus took his time. He stood nearby, watching Mike gasp in pain, and showed no sympathy whatsoever. This was the moment when the world as all these people knew it collapsed. No excuses, no old connections could save Douglas from his fate. There will be no mercy for you. His voice was quiet, but there was no fear or hesitation in it. It was the last sentence. Eliza stood beside him, her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of freedom. She didn't know how it would end, but in that moment she knew one thing. Daddy would avenge her. Let's pause for one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether something similar has happened in your life. We're always happy to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. And now we continue. Mike Douglas, exhausted and reduced to a state of helplessness, lay on the cold asphalt, unable to get up. His body was shaking with pain, and every breath was agonizing. He couldn't understand what was happening. His world was shattered, and his eyes, full of fear and bewilderment, were darting around looking for a rescue that could not come. Marcus Johnson stood beside him, his figure towering like an impregnable mountain. He did not move, did not make a sound. His silence was greater than any shout. He did not shout, he did not rush, he showed no emotion, but it was far more frightening than if he had screamed. He was a silent killer, consuming the very essence of this city, its institutions and ideals that were really nothing. Marcus slowly removed his gloves, stroking the edge of them, and then slid them over his suit, paying no attention to the people around him. He was so cold-blooded that it was like a play in which the audience already knew how it was going to end. Mike struggled to get up, but his body wouldn't listen. He couldn't get to his feet. He was stripped of all his strength, all his confidence. The sense of shame that came over him was worse than any physical pain. He tried to struggle, tried to remember anything that would allow him to save face, but it was useless. Marcus stepped toward him again, and his presence made Douglas stiffen, as if time around him had slowed. He lowered himself to his ear, his breathing quiet and deadly. "Did you think you could humiliate her because she's black? Did you think you could do whatever you wanted with impunity because your white face closed all the doors?" His voice was quiet, but each word cut the air like a knife blade. Mike froze, but his eyes reflected real fear. He was beginning to realize that this moment was not just a physical reckoning. It was deeper than that. It was a defeat of his essence, his whole being, which had once allowed him to look upon others as subordinates. Marcus continued, "You don't realize that you didn't just ruin your life. You destroyed your soul when you laid a hand on it. You lost everything that made you human. You were nothing, Mike. You were nothing. And now you know you're finished." With every word Marcus spoke, Mike felt his chest tighten, as if he were imprisoned in a cage with no way out. His face grew more and more dead pale, and his eyes filled with confusion. He realized that there was no excuse or justification for him. He was just a scumbag, a wreck of the system who used his power to suppress the weak. Suddenly, as if snapped out of a state of hypnosis, Mike reluctantly tried to hold back his tears. His face contorted with realization. He could feel the humiliation consuming him. "Yeah, I can't." He forced himself out, but the words lost all power. Marcus stood up and took a step back, giving Mike some time to think. He felt no anger, no rush to finish the job. Silence was his weapon. Mike continued to sit, gripped by the worst feeling of all, the one that penetrates the man himself, destroying his honor. Marcus looked at him once more, as if to give him a chance to realize that before him stood a man who knew the limits of power. But for Mike, it was already over. Marcus stood and watched, taking his time to move. He knew that Mike would no longer be the man he was, but despite his victory, even within him there remained a sense of uncertainty, because brutal brutality has no winners. It was a moment when everything, both racism and brutality, was gone, leaving only ashes. Mike, like his colleagues, realized that their world would no longer be the same. The hours that had passed since Mike Douglas had knelt before the FBI agent had been like an endless torment for him. He could not realize that his life had changed so drastically that every look, every word, and every gesture now brought down on him all that he had once considered his possessions. His familiar world was crumbling like a house of cards. In the morning, he was still the master of his streets, a loud policeman, feared, looked up to. But now everything had changed. His world had been shattered, and that was just the beginning. When the video of him beating Elise leaked on the internet, it instantly went viral. Thousands of people started sharing it, condemning a police officer who used his power to humiliate a person just because of the color of his skin. The video of him arresting an unarmed girl who continued to behave calmly without resisting quickly became a symbol of racism and abuse of power. As soon as the first comments started appearing on the internet, his phone rang. He tried to justify himself, but no one would listen. Colleagues with whom he had joked during breaks yesterday were now avoiding him. When he tried to go to the station, they wouldn't open the door. The eyes of his former friends stared him in the face, but there was no understanding or support in their gazes. There was only disgust. They knew that they would now be guilty of what had happened if they were ever near him. There were those who lifted their eyes and tried to look away, hiding their fear. But the fear was not for themselves. They were afraid that this man, this racist, had tarnished their reputation. His supervisor called at 10 a.m. "Mike, you need to pull yourself together. This is over. You need to leave. You can't be a part of this team anymore." The voice was cold and determined. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a rejection of what he was. He didn't just lose his job, he lost who he was. With every word his boss said, with every turn of events, he lost what he thought was his strength. His reputation was destroyed. But even worse was that it didn't stop. That evening of the same day, an internal FBI investigation was announced. Not only were they looking into his actions, but they were also trying to find ulterior motives. The police were scrutinizing all of his previous cases, his service reports, every contact, every decision he had ever made. This was not just an investigation. It was a complete expose of his life. The next morning, his face was all over the news channels. Journalists, hungry for sensationalism, unleashed a torrent of accusations against him. Reports about his actions, about his attempt to break the law, caused a storm of protests. The topic of racism in the police, which everyone tried to ignore, now became one of the most discussed in the country. It wasn't just his co-workers who turned their backs on him. His family also began to avoid communication. His wife did not answer his calls. His children did not respond to his messages. They all felt that their lives would now be bound up with shame, with the shame of his actions. Friends who had once been close to him refused to even look in his direction. When Mike was browsing social media, he came across a video that was recorded by protesters at the scene of his arrest of Elise. The video showed people screaming, demanding justice, calling him a murderer. It was more than humiliation. It was a public execution. He saw his face appear in images, memes, how his name became synonymous with racism and brutality. "You deserved it, you bastard," yelled one of the posts. His heart clenched. He tried again and again to find an excuse, but his pride that had once led him was now burned away. He was guilty of what had happened. His racism, his violence, his abuse of power. They were now part of who he was. He could no longer return to his police uniform. He could no longer return to those walls that had once been his home. He could not close his eyes to the shame that was now with him, in his soul and in his life. But the worst was yet to come. Mike Douglas sat in his chair, but he could find no peace. The house that had once seemed like a fortress to him was now like a cage. The dark windows let in no light, and the silence of the night was so oppressive that it felt like a physical presence. His gaze darted around the rooms, searching but not finding. Something was wrong. Something invisible, but deadly real. The phone was ringing off the hook, but every time he picked it up, there was no comfort or excuse. There was only a cold voice on the other end, and after a few words, the connection was cut off. His family ignored him. Former co-workers avoided him. He felt his world shrink to a small room with tightly curtained windows, where every rustle, every sound was like a harbinger of something terrible. It wasn't death, it was life waiting to die. At that moment, Mike realized that it was not murder that was his greatest fear, but that his life was now doomed to shame and humiliation. He sat alone, but every knock on the door, every movement outside the window seemed a portent of the end. He knew that sooner or later he would have to face whatever nightmare would follow. Mike stood up and went to the window, carefully lifting the curtains. The dark street was empty, but there was a strange menace in the air. He felt his pulse quicken, but he couldn't escape the feeling that this was all just the beginning. The real payback was somewhere near. Every bell, every movement outside the window, his heart beat faster and faster, as if invisible hands were clutching his throat. He turned around, hoping to see familiar walls, but everything seemed alien, hostile. He was trapped with no way out. His own home had become a sentence from which there was no escape. Suddenly, there was a new call. It was an unknown number. For a second, Mike thought it might be his wife, trying to talk to him. He was ready to hear some word, some hint of coming back, but it wasn't her. "You think you can still hide, Mike?" The voice was cold, callous, and without a shred of compassion. "You can't hide any more. How mean you are hiding in your house. You're nothing, Mike. You're not a human being anymore. You're a monster, and there's no forgiveness for you." Mike froze, as if the words had come out of his very soul. He couldn't answer. He didn't know who it was, but fear filled him to the brim. Those words tore at his insides. How could he be so wrong? How could he sink so low? The voice continued, as if threatening him not only with words, but with time. With each word, he felt his soul sinking into the abyss. "You will live with this shame for the rest of your life. You will see your life become a living hell. At this point, you can't hide. You have become your own jailer. You'll fear every rustle, every phone call. You will seek forgiveness, but there will be none. You will always be marked." Mike felt his face grow cold, his hands covered in sweat. He realized this wasn't just a threat. It was the beginning of the end. He was no longer safe. He had no place to run to. Every sound, every step on the street was like a sentence, a reminder that his life was ruined. He felt his breathing become shallow, as if he was short of air. The calls didn't stop. He realized that he could no longer live in a world where his actions had become public, where his actions became known to everyone, where his face became synonymous with racism and violence. Mike Douglas couldn't close his eyes to his guilt, and now he knew. His life was empty, his reputation destroyed, and inside him there was only a shadow of the man he once was. That night, he realized that he was not living in a house, but in a cage, where every movement outside the window could be his last. It had been months since Mike Douglas's life had crumbled. The time that was supposed to help him forget had only healed the wounds, but it couldn't heal them. Every morning he woke up in the shadows that had once been his home, but now that home had become his prison. His eyes no longer sparkled with confidence. They were empty, anxious, constantly running, not knowing where to hide from reality. His hands trembled as if he was under constant electrical tension. He tried to hold on, But every movement, every glance made him feel his body disintegrating. Fear was his constant companion, and his mind, once confident and cold-blooded, was now just a tattered fabric of memories. Mike was no longer the man he once knew. He was just a wreck of the system that had taught him that power could be used as a weapon, that it was possible to humiliate others without consequences. But now the consequences were here, and they were eating him from the inside out. Every day he sat in his empty house, which had become a trap rather than a defense for him. He couldn't go to the store, couldn't go outside without feeling stares filled with contempt, hatred, even fear. He had lost everything that had once been important. But that wasn't the scary part. The worst part was that he knew his nightmare wasn't over. The revenge of Marcus Johnson, the very man he had once humiliated, was not complete. He knew that sooner or later he would face something that would make his life unbearable. Every night he awoke to a noise outside the door, to something moving in the shadows. Every creak of the floor, every sound in the night made his heart pound frantically in his chest. It was like a perpetual game with his own nerves. He sat in the dark, unable to sleep, listening to his fear eat away at him more and more. He didn't know if it was his constant inner nightmare or something much more terrifying. He was starting to lose control. His thoughts, which had once been clear, were now blurred. He saw every stranger as a threat, heard Marcus's footsteps in every sound, heard him coming toward him. Sometimes he thought he would hear that sound, and it would be the last step, the step that would put an end to his life. He couldn't get rid of that thought. He couldn't get rid of the thought that the punishment for all he had done was still not complete. One night, when the fog covered the streets and all sounds seemed even heavier than usual, Mike felt his heart clench again. He had heard footsteps. It wasn't just imagination. They were footsteps. Footsteps that were approaching his door. He jumped up from his chair, his heart clenched in his chest. Fear enveloped him. He knew it wasn't just the sound of silence. It was something real, something he could no longer ignore. He sprinted to the door and peered through the crack, but saw nothing. The darkness outside the door swallowed everything. The footsteps continued. They didn't stop. Suddenly, out of the darkness came a voice, calm but with an eerie certainty. "Did you think you could run away, Mike? Did you think that after everything you'd just disappear?" Mike felt his breath hitch. He couldn't believe this was really happening. He knew who it was. It was him. It was Marcus. "You destroyed everything that was important to you. You've lost your soul, your life. You can no longer live in this world as you once did. You've lost everything." The words echoed in the silence of the night, and there was no anger in them. There was only silent condemnation. In that moment, Mike realized that his life would not end in solitary retribution. He wouldn't be able to just disappear, hide, and forget. Marcus was there for him. Mike, unable to stand any longer, sank to his knees. He could no longer resist. His body was trembling. He knew that something even worse would follow this nighttime visit. The dark footsteps kept getting closer, and Mike knew he couldn't hide. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your opinion is very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Please write in the comments, share your thoughts, subscribe to our channel, and put a like if you liked it. We are always happy to see your participation. Wishing you a good day. Write the phrase, "I'm with you to the end," in the comments so we know you listened to this story to the end.